Landon Drake gritted his teeth as he shoved his shovel into the thick snow, his breath forming clouds in the freezing morning air. His hands were numb, even through his worn-out gloves, but he didn't have the luxury of stopping. Rent was due, and the extra cash from clearing driveways in the wealthy part of town meant his 5-year-old daughter, Lily, wouldn't go to bed hungry. He had just finished one driveway when he spotted another, completely buried under a thick blanket of snow. The house was massive modern glass windows, sleek black doors, and a luxury car parked in the driveway, almost invisible beneath the snow. Probably some rich person who hadn't even thought to hire someone to clear it. With a deep sigh, Landon adjusted his beanie and got to work. Inside the house, Juliette Westwood stared out the window, watching as a man steadily cleared her driveway. She hadn't hired anyone, which meant he was either doing it out of desperation or sheer kindness. Either way, she was intrigued. She had inherited her family's fortune, but she never flaunted it. It had been years since she had met someone who didn't know her name before shaking her hand. And this man, he was different. He worked with a quiet determination, his broad shoulders straining as he shoveled, his strong hands gripping the handle like he was battling the elements themselves. Curious, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The cold air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. "You know, I never asked you to do this," she called out. Landon paused, looking up, startled. He hadn't heard her come out. She was beautiful long dark hair spilling over her shoulders, piercing green eyes, and a confidence that made it clear she wasn't used to being questioned. "I know," he said, straightening, "but it needed to be done." She folded her arms, studying him. "And you're doing it. Why?" He shrugged. "I clear driveways for extra cash, figured this one could use it." Juliette tilted her head, intrigued by his blunt honesty. "How much do I owe you?" Landon hesitated. Most of the rich people in this neighborhood either ignored him or paid him with a half-hearted wave. She was different, actually looking at him like he was a real person. $50, he finally said. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill and handed it to him. His brows furrowed. "This is too much. Consider it a tip." She flashed him a small smile, "Or maybe just payment for a job well done." Landon hesitated before finally taking the money. "Thanks," she nodded, about to turn back toward the house when she paused. "You must be freezing. Want to come inside for some coffee?" He should have said no. He didn't belong in houses like this. But his hands were shaking from the cold, and there was something about her, something warm beneath her polished exterior. "Yeah," he said, "that'd be nice." As he stepped inside, Juliette had no idea that this struggling father would soon turn her world upside down. And Landon. He had no clue he had just caught the attention of a woman who had everything except love. Landon stepped inside, the warmth of the house instantly wrapping around him. His boots left faint traces of melting snow on the pristine hardwood floor, and for a brief moment, he felt out of place. The space was expansive, modern, and unmistakably expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the winter landscape outside, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Juliette walked ahead of him, her movements unhurried. She gestured toward the open-concept kitchen, where sleek marble counters gleamed under the soft lighting. "Have a seat," she said, grabbing 2 mugs from a nearby cabinet. "How do you take it?" "Black," Landon replied, rubbing his hands together for warmth. He hesitated before lowering himself onto one of the stools by the island. The leather seat felt foreign beneath him, too smooth, too untouched by wear. Juliette filled both mugs and set one in front of him before leaning against the counter. "You do this often?" Shoveling. "Yeah," he said, lifting the cup to his lips. The heat spread through him, soothing the chill in his bones. "Pays the bills." She studied him briefly before taking a sip of her own coffee. "And what do you do when you're not clearing driveways?" Landon exhaled, setting his mug down. "Construction." "When there's work, lately it's been slow." Juliette nodded, absorbing the words without a trace of pity. "Must be tough." He met her gaze. There was no condescension in her voice, no attempt to make him feel small, just curiosity. "It is," he admitted, "but I get by." Her fingers traced the edge of her mug. "You live around here?" He shook his head. "Other side of town. It's different." Juliette didn't press, but he could tell she understood. The divide between their worlds was obvious. He didn't need to spell it out. A comfortable silence settled between them before she set her mug down and leaned forward slightly. "You ever get tired of it?" he frowned. "Of what?" "Working so hard just to stay afloat." Landon let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, but close. "Every day." "But I don't have the luxury of stopping." She tilted her head. "Because of your family?" His jaw tensed. He hadn't mentioned Lily, but something in his expression must have given him away. "My daughter," he said after a pause. "She's 5. Juliette's expression softened. "That's a big responsibility." "It is," he admitted, "but she's worth it." For the first time since stepping into the house, Landon felt something shift. It wasn't just a wealthy woman offering him coffee, it was a conversation, an exchange that felt real. Juliette hesitated, then glanced toward the wide windows. "I don't usually invite strangers inside." He arched a brow. "And yet here I am." She smiled faintly. "I suppose I was curious." "About what?" She took a slow sip of her coffee before answering. "Someone who works as hard as you does it for a reason. I wanted to know what that reason was." Landon considered her for a moment. Most people looked at him and saw only struggle. She saw something else. "You always let curiosity guide you?" he asked. "More often than I should," she admitted. He huffed a quiet laugh. "Could get you into trouble." Juliette met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. "Maybe, but sometimes it leads to interesting places." Landon didn't know what to make of that. But as he sat there, thawing in the warmth of her home, he had a feeling this was one of those moments that would stay with him. And he had no idea it was just the beginning. Landon wiped his hands on his jeans, the heat from the coffee still warming his palms as he sat in Juliette's pristine kitchen. He had no business being here, in a house that probably cost more than he'd make in a lifetime, but she didn't seem bothered by the contrast between them. If anything, she seemed intrigued by it. Juliette set her empty mug down and leaned against the counter, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place. "You're not what I expected," she said. His brows lifted slightly. "What did you expect?" She considered for a moment before answering. "Most people who come through this neighborhood either want something or assume I do." Landon exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I'm just trying to get through the day." Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "Refreshing." He wasn't sure what to make of that, but he wasn't about to question it. He had work to do, and sitting in a millionaire's kitchen wasn't part of his usual routine. He pushed back from the counter, reaching for his coat. "I should get going," he said. Juliette didn't stop him, but there was a flicker of something in her expression. "Disappointment? No, that didn't make sense." "You ever do work beyond shoveling?" she asked. Landon paused, meeting her gaze. "Why?" She tilted her head slightly. "I have a place upstate. It needs some repairs. Nothing major, just work I keep putting off." He studied her, trying to gauge her intentions. "You want me to fix your house?" She shrugged. "If you're interested." Landon hesitated. He could use the money, but this felt different. He wasn't sure what she was offering, a job, a connection, or something else entirely. "I don't take charity," he said. Her expression didn't change. "Good, I don't give it." That made him pause. He wasn't sure what to make of her, but there was something about the way she said it like she meant it. "How much work?" he asked. "A few days' worth. Maybe a week, depending on how thorough you are," Landon considered. He needed steady income, and she was offering it without any strings. At least none he could see. "All right," he said finally. "I'll take a look." Juliette nodded, as if she had expected that answer all along. "I'll send you the address." Landon pulled his coat on, still feeling like he was stepping into something bigger than he understood. He should walk away, keep his life simple, but something about her made him hesitate. "See you soon, then," he said, before heading for the door. As he stepped back into the cold, he had no idea that this job wasn't just about fixing a house. It was about disrupting everything he thought he knew about his life and hers. Landon tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he pulled up to the address Juliette had sent him. The estate sat on a sprawling piece of land, edged with towering evergreens, the kind of place that looked like it had been plucked from a luxury magazine. It wasn't just a house, it was a retreat, a world away from the noise of the city. He stepped out of his truck, boots crunching against the gravel driveway. The air smelled crisp, fresh, untainted by the usual sense of car exhaust and city life. He tried not to let the sheer size of the place intimidate him. It was a job, nothing more. Juliette was already waiting for him at the front door, dressed in a thick sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look effortlessly elegant. She didn't seem out of place here. She belonged in a world of quiet wealth and understated luxury. He, on the other hand, was still trying to figure out why he had agreed to this. She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. The inside was just as impressive as the outside vaulted ceilings, wide windows that let in an abundance of natural light, and furniture that looked like it had been selected by someone with impeccable taste. "I wasn't exaggerating about the work," she said, as she led him down a hallway. "Some of the flooring needs repairs, a few doors don't close properly, and there's an issue with the heating in one of the guest rooms." He nodded, already scanning the space with a professional eye. "I'll take a look. Shouldn't take more than a few days if I have the right supplies." She folded her arms, watching him as he assessed the first set of repairs. "You always work alone." He crouched down, running his fingers along a loose floorboard. "Most of the time, must get lonely." He glanced up at her. "Not really, keeps things simple." She didn't argue, but he could tell she had opinions about that. Instead, she walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "I used to come here as a kid," she said after a pause. "It was my family's getaway. My father always wanted a place where we could escape when city life got overwhelming." He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Sounds nice." "It was," she admitted, "but I think I liked it more when it didn't feel so empty." Landon understood that kind of loneliness. The kind that sat in the corners of a place, no matter how big or beautiful it was. "You thinking of selling?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I want to fix it up, make it feel like home again." There was something in the way she said it that made him pause. It wasn't just about the house. It was something deeper, something unspoken. He nodded toward the hallway. "I should get started." She turned back to him, studying him in a way that made his pulse do something it shouldn't. "I'll let you work," she said, her voice softer than before. Over the next few days, Landon threw himself into the repairs, focusing on the tasks at hand. But no matter how much he tried to keep things professional, Juliette was always there, watching him, talking to him, making him question why he felt so drawn to her. She wasn't like the people he had met in the past, the ones who looked at him and only saw what he didn't have. She listened. She asked questions that felt like they mattered, and the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the pull between them. One evening, as he packed up his tools for the day, she appeared in the doorway, holding 2 glasses of whiskey. "I figured you could use a break," she said, handing him one. He hesitated before taking it, the warmth of the drink spreading through him as he took a sip. She leaned against the wall, watching him. "You don't let people in easily, do you?" he exhaled, rolling the glass between his hands. "Never seemed like a good idea." She tilted her head. "Why?" He met her gaze, the honesty in her eyes making it impossible to deflect. "Because when you let people in, they have the power to leave." She didn't look away. "Not everyone leaves." Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. Before he could think better of it, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She didn't move away. If anything, she leaned into his touch. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "This isn't a good idea." She searched his face, her expression unreadable. Why not? Because she was a millionaire, because he was struggling to make ends meet. Because they came from 2 different worlds that weren't meant to collide. But none of those reasons mattered when she was standing so close, her breath mingling with his, her presence making him forget every logical argument he had. So instead of answering, he did the only thing that felt right. He kissed her. Landon had meant for the kiss to be fleeting, something quick and forgettable, a mistake made in the glow of firelight and whiskey. But the moment their lips met, he knew it was anything but. Juliette didn't hesitate. She kissed him back with a slow, deliberate intensity that made his pulse hammer. Her hands slid up his arms, fingers curling against the fabric of his worn jacket. He should have pulled away, reminded them both of the reasons this was a bad idea: her wealth, his struggles, the undeniable gap between their worlds. But none of it mattered in that moment. When they finally broke apart, her breath was uneven, her green eyes searching his. He expected her to say something, to throw logic between them like a barrier, but she didn't. Instead, she traced her thumb over his jaw, her touch feather-light. He exhaled, forcing himself to take a step back. "This isn't what I came here for," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Juliette didn't look away. "I know." Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. The fire crackled in the background, the only sound in the vast house. She set her glass down on the nearby table, her fingers lingering on the rim. "You think too much, you know that?" Landon let out a short breath, shaking his head. "Someone has to." Something flickered in her expression. "You don't trust this." He met her gaze head-on. "I don't trust things that come this easy." Juliette let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You think this is easy?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustration curling in his chest. "You live in a world where things happen because you want them to. Mine doesn't work that way." She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "You think I've never had to fight for something?" Landon hesitated. He had assumed maybe unfairly that her life had been carved out for her, paved with comfort and privilege. But there was something in her voice, a sharp edge that made him question that assumption. He inhaled deeply, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter." "Doesn't it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the doorway, needing space, needing air. But before he could take another step, Juliette spoke again. "I don't care about any of it," she said, her voice quieter now. "Not the money, not the expectations people have for me. I care about what's real." Landon froze. When he finally turned back, she was watching him with an honesty that made it impossible to walk away. "You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you don't belong," she continued. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who only see what I have, not who I am." Landon clenched his jaw. He wanted to believe her. Hell, he already did, but it didn't change the reality of their situation. He couldn't afford to get caught up in something that would only complicate his life further. "I should go," he said, his voice low. She didn't stop him as he turned and walked out. But when he stepped into the cold night, the weight in his chest told him leaving didn't feel like the right choice either. The next morning, Landon arrived at the estate earlier than usual, hoping to finish the last of the repairs without any lingering tension from the night before. Juliette was already awake, sitting at the kitchen counter with a steaming cup of coffee. She looked up when he walked in, but didn't say anything right away. Landon set his tool bag down, exhaling. "About last night, you don't have to explain," he frowned. "I think I do." She studied him for a moment before setting down her mug. "All right." Landon ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't good at this explaining, talking about things that weren't just problems to be solved. "I didn't leave because I didn't want it," he admitted. "I left because I did." Juliette's expression didn't change, but something in her posture softened. "I don't have the luxury of making mistakes," he continued. "I have a daughter who depends on me. I can't afford to get caught up in something that what?" He let out a slow breath. "Something that won't last." Juliette's lips parted slightly, but she didn't immediately respond. Then, after a long pause, she said, "You think this is temporary?" Landon hesitated. "Isn't it?" She shook her head, stepping closer. "Not unless you want it to be." He searched her face, looking for any sign that she was saying this just to ease his doubts, but all he saw was sincerity. Juliette reached for his hand, her touch careful but certain. "I know what I want, Landon." "Do you?" He swallowed hard. The logical part of him was screaming to walk away, to keep things simple, but logic had never made his heart race like this. So instead of answering, he did the one thing he had been trying to resist since the moment he met her. He pulled her in and kissed her again. This time, he didn't fight it. Landon felt the warmth of Juliette's body against his as their kiss deepened, the world outside the estate fading into nothing. He had spent so much of his life holding back, making choices out of necessity rather than want. But this was different. He wanted her, wanted this, and for once he let himself have it. When they finally broke apart, her breath was uneven, her hands still resting lightly on his chest. He could feel the rapid beat of her pulse beneath his fingers, mirroring his own. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The weight of what had just happened, of what it meant, settled between them. Juliette was the first to break the silence. "You don't get to run this time." Landon exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I'm not running." She arched a brow, her gaze steady. Good, because I'm not letting you. A quiet laugh escaped him, unexpected but real. You always this stubborn. Only when it matters. He studied her, the unwavering certainty in her expression. He had spent so long believing that people like her, people with wealth, privilege, and options, would never truly see someone like him. But Juliette wasn't like anyone he had ever met. She wasn't looking for a distraction or a passing thrill. She wanted something real. And for the first time in years, Landon let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have that too. The following days were a blur of stolen moments and quiet confessions, of late-night talks by the fire and mornings spent wrapped in each other's warmth. The estate, once a place that felt distant and untouchable, now felt like something entirely different, a place where he belonged. Juliette never treated him like he was temporary. She made space for him in her world, never once making him feel like he had to prove his worth. And that terrified him more than anything, because for the first time he had something to lose. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the last light of the day fade behind the trees, Juliette turned to him, her gaze thoughtful. "I want you to stay." Landon froze, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand. "What?" She shifted, turning to face him fully. "Here, with me." His heart pounded. "Juliette, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "That our lives are different, that this doesn't make sense, but it does, you know it does." Landon inhaled sharply, setting his glass down on the wooden railing. "My life isn't, I don't care about any of that." Her voice softened. "I care about you." "About us?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw nothing but honesty. No ulterior motives, no expectations, just love. He had spent years believing that love like this wasn't meant for him. That it was something other people got to have, people who didn't have to fight for every inch of stability. But Juliette wasn't offering him charity. She was offering him a life, a future. His throat tightened. "You're sure about this?" Her lips curved slightly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Landon exhaled slowly, the weight of his fears pressing against his ribs. But as he looked at her, at the woman who had changed everything, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. He reached for her, pulling her close, his lips brushing against her temple. "Then I'm staying." Juliette smiled against his skin, her arms wrapping around him. "Good." Months later, the estate had transformed not just in structure but in feeling. What had once been a cold, empty space now felt like home. Landon had finished the repairs, but he hadn't left. He had built something here, not just with his hands but with his heart. And Juliette was at the center of it all. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Landon stood in the warm glow of the living room, watching Juliette curl up on the couch with a book in her hands. His chest tightened. He had never been the kind of man to plan ahead, to think about things like forever. But with her, forever felt like the only option. Taking a deep breath, he reached into his pocket, his fingers curling around the small velvet box. He walked over, kneeling in front of her. Juliette blinked, surprised. "What are you?" Before she could finish, he opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring. Her breath hitched. Landon swallowed hard. "I never thought I'd have this. A home. A future, he exhaled. "But you changed everything, Juliette. And I don't want a life without you." Her eyes shimmered, her hand covering her mouth. Landon's voice was steady as he spoke the words that had been building inside him for weeks. "Marry me." Juliette let out a breathless laugh, tears slipping down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes." Landon slid the ring onto her finger, his heart racing as she pulled him into a kiss, sealing a promise that had been written between them from the very beginning. He wasn't just staying, he was home. 1 year later, the estate was alive with laughter and warmth as friends and family gathered to celebrate their wedding. Landon adjusted his tie, nerves settling deep in his stomach, but the moment he saw Juliette walking toward him, all of it disappeared. She was breathtaking, her dress flowing around her like something out of a dream. But it wasn't just her beauty that made his chest tighten, it was the way she looked at him, like he was her future, like he was enough. When she reached him, he took her hands, squeezing gently. The minister spoke, but Landon barely heard the words. All he could focus on was her, the woman who had changed everything. And when it was time to speak his vows, his voice was unwavering. "I never believed in fate," he admitted. "Never thought life had anything more to offer me than survival. But then I met you, and you made me believe in more." His fingers tightened around hers. "You are my home, Juliette, my beginning and my end, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Juliette's eyes shimmered as she whispered her own vows, her voice thick with emotion. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Landon didn't hesitate. He pulled her in, kissing her with every ounce of love he had in him. Cheers erupted around them, but he barely heard it, because in this moment, in her arms, nothing else mattered. He had found his forever. And he was never letting go.